We know that when we get people right, we get business right. So I'd like to welcome you back to a revamped podcast with shorter episodes that focus on 3 areas that I specialise in: leadership, performance, and culture. You'll hear my guests talking about their experiences and expertise, and we'll be providing thought-provoking insights around putting the human factor back into business. Each conversation will be accompanied by a free downloadable guide to save the strain on your memory, and resources that will make it easier to put the great ideas we discuss into action. I'm your host, Lisa, psychologist, psychotherapist, and founder of It's Time for Change, and I thrive on conversations that make a difference. So reach out to me. My details are in the show notes along with the resources. So grab a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. I am very excited to be able to welcome Gareth Weir, who's the Deputy Ambassador, British Embassy, Seoul, to join me today. Thanks so much for making this work, Gareth, particularly with the time difference.
My pleasure. Nice to see you, Lisa, and thank you for your time and for including me in your excellent podcast.
So I really wanted to get you on my podcast because you recently recorded a TEDx talk. Now, we can't hear it yet because it's not yet live. It will be coming. But I have been lucky enough to hear from you some of what you talked about. And there's so much in there that is so relevant to my listeners that I wanted to get on and kind of unpack some of that with you. So I want to dive straight in to the fact that you talk about there being no sidelines anymore. How did your early experiences, including growing up in West Africa, which I didn't actually know about you, shape your view of how connected we all are?
Yeah. So I say I was very fortunate to do a TEDx recently here at Seoul. Along the themes are sort of like Diplo tips, and so they challenge to sort of think about the world of diplomacy, but its relevance to all different sorts of societies or organisations or indeed families and communities. So that's the kind of background to it. And so some of the things that I've thought hard about is what are some of the things that are core to diplomacy which are relevant to perhaps other spheres of life. But your question, so I grew up in West Africa, and so I grew up. Parents are teachers, so in a sense I grew up different all around me, different sort of food and culture and languages. And so from the outset, I guess I was sort of had a sort of reasonably global perspective. The world's quite a big place, and there are lots of different types of people in the world. And then I guess through my experience working in sort of private sector and then more latterly in the public sector, got to see and learn and think about how interconnected the world really is. And I guess in some ways it's relatively straightforward. Like you talk to our children and say, look at that phone that you've got, and think about where it came from, right? You might have like parts of it that come from the DRC. You might have microprocessors come from Taiwan, the screen from Korea, might assemble in China, designed in California, and shipped to Korea for us to use here, or the UK for you to use there. So that is like, it's just integrated, interconnected product that we all have, or many people have. And so for me, that speaks volumes about the world that we live in today. The reality is that we are all interconnected in different ways. And if you think about that and believe that, if you think about things like climate and things like, media nowadays is all interconnected, like a Truth Social post over here can change markets over there. And so if you think that through, for me, that means then we're not like observing the world as if the world is over there and we have our wonderful protected space over here. We're all part of it. We're all part of this system in some way. And therefore, we have some agency. So in the sense, then, we are part of both the problem and the solution, which is, for me, one of the key things that I guess I learned through my professional career, but more latterly in the kind of diplomatic career.
I think that part about just taking a moment to think about where those connections are is really important, isn't it? Because I think we turn up, we just show up in a way that can just stay quite surface level. We're almost just moving along at speed, and to actually stop and think about where those connections are and what they mean, and perhaps which ones we like, which ones we don't, because often people don't necessarily think about the implications of fashion, for example, is a really good example when I'm talking to my daughter about certain brands and where they come from, and it's about making those connections. So I think that's really important. I am really, I've never had anyone who's a deputy ambassador on my podcast before. You are a first, so I want you to tell me about what parts of your diplomatic journey have been most influenced, and also have most influenced how you think about leadership and shared challenges today.
Um, I guess I've been fortunate enough to kind of serve in a variety of different contexts and countries over my time, and I guess that's been, that's for me, that's there's nothing better than sort of really living in and trying to imbibe and understand a different culture or country. You can do this in any, I think, any community. There are differences everywhere, really, but in our world, in the diplomacy, when you get sort of posted overseas, that's kind of core to your job, is to really try and get under the skin of what's happening in that country, thinking hard about the politics and the business, and what drives that country and what the interests are of that country, and the different sort of leaders and stakeholder groups there. So that's kind of core to them, to the role, if you like. And I guess through that, again, it helps you. I guess you both understand what we all have in common, sort of core humanity, the things that you see that are common across many different experiences, but also the very different sort of perspectives and background and norms and expectation, and things which are perhaps obvious to you to me from my sort of cultural background are completely different, and could be offensive to someone else in a different culture. And it's fascinating, I find, just those differences and how they kind of collide.
Mm.
Um, in meetings. And so, for example, in Korea, the kind of hierarchy and the kind of respect, how you meet someone, how you introduce them, is very, very different to the UK. And so again, just really understanding that, and that's just surface level in some ways, but it speaks volumes for the system there is
Yeah.
here, and the expectations. And so I think it's you sort of thrown into it in the kind of diplomatic sense, because you have to understand it to kind of be effective. But I still think it's relevant, even if you're, wherever you are in the world. I think the same principle applies, really.
I think, yeah, I couldn't agree more, because I think there's a whole the sort of emotional interdependence that you have within teams. So even, I was talking recently with some people around, within a team meeting, you might have different people at different levels of a hierarchy, and that power imbalance, and people, I've heard leaders turn up and say, "Well, like, it's fine. I'm just going to be one of the group." And you're like, "But you're never just one of the group if you are the MD or the CEO, or you're at the top of the kind of pecking order, if you like, unless you are very clear to set the scene, which and to show your vulnerabilities, and to be very conscious in terms of how you show up and how you invite others to speak up. Because if you don't set that space up intentionally, people revert back to what they think are the connections, and that often is influenced by that kind of power imbalance, which can just block so much potential good stuff that could be in that room.
Yeah, I think very well said. The power dynamics are a key thing that I think you think about. So again, in diplomacy, you think about it a lot. Like, what are the power dynamics going on here in the country? Like, who are the decision makers? Who's influencing? But
Mm.
it's equally applicable in one's business, I think, or community or neighborhood, because it's the same set of it's the same set of, I think, principles there of really understanding what the relationships are. And if you're a leader of an organization, then I think you're absolutely right. There's an immediate power imbalance there, or power dynamic to understand, and how you use that power and how open you are about that power. And when you want to be, non-hierarchical, and why, and when you want to assert hierarchy, or sort of more assertive leadership, and why. So I think it's the same set of principles, but I say the most effective leaders for me are those that really do understand that and think deeply about that as a concept for
Yeah.
leading teams.
So let's move on to think about a bit about your approach to leadership and influence. You describe curiosity as a strategic tool, which I absolutely love, because I always talk about curiosity as being absolutely essential. What does listening loudly mean in diplomacy?
So I think this is right at the core of, for me, good diplomacy, because for me, you understand that listening is like it's not passive, it's active, it's strategic. It's someone who thinks deeply and listens deeply to what people say, but more importantly, what's left unsaid,
Mm.
and who's saying it and who's not saying it, and who's in the room and who's not in the room. If you like, there's this term that I've sort of came across recently called exclamation. So not information, which is normally the kind of words you say or words that you write, but the exclamation. So all the things that people associate with you, or the context, or the norm, or your communication style, which then influence how they read the information and understand it. And for me, that's a good, maybe a helpful way of thinking about it. But it is all about the context and the norms and the environment by which the words are being delivered, which I think then gives you much deeper understanding. And so curiosity to me is about asking those bigger questions. So not just listening to the words, but really thinking hard about why they're saying this and who's saying it, and what's going on in the room here. And again, the most adept, impactful leaders for me, have really high EI, because that's part of how to make that work really well, by sort of sensing and understanding that.
Yeah, that emotional intelligence piece is essential, and it's still something that I don't think many leaders take seriously enough. They still see it as a bit of a nice to have, or it's not. It's stuff about being a nice person rather than being an essential tool for being a good business person. But it might come on to that. So you, in your TEDx, you talk about the Nepal shadowing story, which is really powerful. What did that experience teach you about understanding what really matters to partners or stakeholders?
So I refer to this example in when I was in Nepal, and we were having real issues at the time with the Ministry of Finance, and disagreements about how best that we could support them in that sort of post-earthquake reconstruction, as it was, and lots of meetings with sort of friction and ended up sort of disagreement. And it got me thinking that perhaps I, wasn't listening loudly enough to really understand what was going on here. And so I asked basically the Ministry of Finance and the sort of senior servant who was leading it if I could come and do a day's workshop. So like no strings attached, just wanted to come and understand his job, the organization, the processes, understand some of the constraints and pressures that he was under and the system was under in this particularly difficult time post the earthquake. And I think it's the first time somebody anyone's ever asked him that, and he's, I think, almost like sort of intrigue. Said, yeah, okay, let's do this. It's very odd. So I spent a very fun day sat next to him through all of his meetings. And obviously all the Nepali stakeholders who came into the meetings were kind of shocked to find out I was just sat there listening, because obviously, what is this guy doing? Very odd. But I think he enjoyed the fact that it was someone there was a part, sort of partly studying, partly learning from him. And, so for me, it worked really well, because it enabled me to have a kind of very different relationship with him during the day, and talk about, in the downtime, talk about him as a person and his background and family, etc. But also my sort of keen, by sort of demonstrating a real interest in what was on his mind, feel like what his interests were, what was driving him and his decision making, allowed then me to frame what we were trying to do in a completely different way.
Mm.
Ultimately we're trying to get to kind of shared interests in these conversations. I mean, I guess we can talk a bit about this, but moving from a kind of combatant and a zero sum win lose to much more like, well, really, what are your core interests, and what are my core interests as the, in this case, the UK government, and how do we find those shared interests? And so for me, that was a good way of sort of unpicking some of that and getting beneath the surface to then at least enable better conversations.
That is brilliant. So I love the fact that you were shadowing, because again, I think there's so much to learn when people do that, at all levels of organizations. So people more senior kind of coming down, people more junior shadowing further up, but also across different teams and different departments, because there's often this sense of blame, like, well, then they're the people who don't work quite as hard as our team, or they always moan about this bit or that bit. And you think, actually, if you understood what people were trying to do in their role, and how everything again is connected, so they will moan if you haven't done this bit because they can't do their next bit. And so I think that shadowing is so vital to adding an extra level of empathy and then kind of motivation for people to be able to fulfill what they need to do. But also what you're saying about the drivers of behavior, I think that's so often missed. So if people understand what it is that's really motivating people to think the way they're thinking or behave the way they're behaving, and that is the bit that's often overlooked. So people are too busy trying to rush to a solution or assume this is what people want and actually let's just crack on and try to achieve as quickly as possible without just stopping going, right, is this the right thing, and why do people think this is the right thing, and what's a different way of doing it, and actually unpick kind of the motivation behind it. And we get at those drivers of behavior, as you say, you suddenly then in the right place to find the right solutions that work.
Yeah. Exactly. And again, I think so something that I try to do a lot, but I think some of the best organizations I've sort of worked with in my time but do this where, yeah, you're right, where people spend time with each other so whether that's like leaders walking the floor or whether that's like deliberately sitting in a very different part of the organization and saying, I'm going to sit here today just to be part of your team. And again, it can be quite sort of shocking or, but I think in a helpful way. Because you get some of the downtime with them as well, and you can just observe them working, and you learn so much just by being with people, right? So again, so for me, I think this runs right across all different organizations. It's this curiosity to like really try and understand, as you said, what drives people in teams, and try and famous phrase, but sit with them and walk in their shoes. So you get a much better sense, and you can be much more empathetic then to where they are and what's on their mind.
Yeah. So another question, and again, this is a question I love, is about asking what might I be missing? How does that question, Gareth, for you change the way we can lead people and collaborate?
I think it's a great question. Not asked often enough
Yeah.
in today's world. And again, I think to me, this speaks volumes to the type of leader who has the confidence to ask it. So it's sort of the changing dynamic of, effectively somebody who has all the answers or someone who, is assumed to be omniscient in some sense, to people saying that these are complicated challenges that we, especially in the world today, many of the things we're facing, are complex and complicated. And so it's only by a kind of collective hive effort that we stand a chance of managing them well. So I think that's a good question to ask. We try to, in some of the organizations I work with and for, have that sense of having space for challenge. Whether that, for example, here we have like a shadow board, so like a board that reviews all the same papers that we as the SLT review. And that's basically part of the question they'll be testing is like, what are we missing in this? Like, what is your perspective on it? What don't we see from your lived experience of A, B, C, D? What is it you would say to this question? And I think you need those mechanisms for constructive challenge and diverse inputs in an efficient and effective way, right? You can over consult and not get anywhere. So the secret is to find the really sort of efficient and punchy ways to get that question answered.
Yeah.
There's real diversity in voices that answer that question. So it's not the same type of people who think in the same type of way with the same lived experience as you answering it.
But I think I love the fact you mentioned the word space there, because that having space to stop and reflect and think about what it is we're doing and have we got the information we need, and to ask, what might I be missing from your perspective, it goes back to what you were saying earlier about being strategic in terms of how you're thinking and speaking and so on. People tend to go too fast. They tend to be very task focused in terms of we must just crack on through our meeting agenda or we must crack on and solve this problem. But actually, when we have the space to ask questions like what might I be missing, not only do you get better information, but you have that wonderful sense of psychological safety coming through in terms of, people often talk about how do I create psychological safety in my team? But when you get leaders asking questions like what might be missing, what should I be asking? What does this look like from your perspective? it's really amplifying the voices of other people and showing that sense of genuine curiosity and care, and you matter, your opinion matters, your experience matters. I think it's so valuable.
Yeah. And I would say that, I mean, both, so absolutely needs to be sort of role modeled in leaders who sort of take that on in the way they do their business day to day. But as I said, the real secret is to sort of find the kind of right structures and processes or governance to be able to get that done in a way which is kind of then a bit more systemic.
Yeah.
So it's not just reliant on who's in front of me on the day and I've just remembered to ask the question. It's like I'm trying to design my governance of this organization or business in a way which bakes that in as an expectation, as a way in which we all operate. So that, and then people know. And so again, it allows people who think differently, who like to spend time thinking and writing, versus those that can just immediately offer their views. You get a bit of diversity and approaches there. So again, for me, the secret is how, and again, in an efficient, effective way. You don't want over governance and over consultation, but you definitely need to get the right balance there.
Yeah. So let's move from curiosity to connection and trust. So what's been your experience in South Korea that sort of taught you about the role of trust in long-term influence?
So we've been here about 3 years now, and fantastic country. If you've not been, by the way, just to put it on the tourist agenda or business agenda spot. Really fascinating country that's come an enormous long way in the last 75 years. So 1950, just out of the Korean War, one of the poorest countries in the world, and here we are, 2025. Look at what they're achieving right across the spectrum. Most of us would have eaten, Korean food and seen K-pops and K-dramas and K-beauty and the rest of it. So a lot to learn from Korea and what it's managed to do in the last 75 years or so, and what it's going to do in the future. So it's an exciting place to be, and so clearly the UK has big interests here. Whether that's trying to connecting our people or our businesses or our universities or our research and development or our militaries. And what I sort of learned from here, but sort of I guess mentioned from previous experiences, is around how you best deliver that influence to deliver on what the kind of UK priorities. Doesn't come from winning arguments necessarily, right? It's not about winning any argument. What I've learned is, people often forget what you say, but they rarely forget how you make them feel. And so the secret is that sort of connection, and particularly in societies like Korea, it's all about trust. Even if you have very different interests and objectives in the discussion, if there is a core, trust that comes from a good faith that we really are trying to work towards something of a shared solution here, you can achieve so much more than the kind of, this is my perspective, that's your perspective. It has to be one or the other. So for me, that's around then how do you do that, right? Which is all about the kind of, as we talked a little bit before, around the curiosity, the connections, investing in relationships, really spending time understanding the Korean culture and the people and the backgrounds. That helps build that connection, which is really sort of needed to help then deliver on, whatever the objectives were, this business deal, or influencing science and technology sort of standards or progress of the future. So it's been influence through sort of empathy and alignment, and not through sort of dominance and winning arguments.
And that's quite a hard thing, I think, for moving back from that dominance, isn't it? That sense of authority and control. And I think that's a space that I think a lot of leaders struggle with, to let go of that need for either a need for control and authority, or a belief that that is how they're supposed to show up to fulfill their role and be seen to be successful, and to move from that to having more empathy and more relational influence. So kind of, like you said, about being able to really connect with people and have a sense of shared purpose, and you're a team, you're in it together, rather than I'm here to tell you what to do. I think that's a place that people struggle with. I love what you said about it's not what you say, it's how you make people feel. And if people could think a little bit more around that how they show up and how they enable other people to show up and what they take away from those encounters. Again, it goes back to we're in this together. We're on the same page rather than I'm being told what to do and kind of my feelings don't matter. So it's a huge shift for some leaders to move from that authority control to that sense of actually we are a team and we are all players in the same team. We just happen to have different positions.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, for me, it's, again, some of the best leaders I've seen and worked with, are really adept at flexing their leadership style. So, at points, leaders definitely need to be sort of leading from the front and directing and, dictating in some ways. And other points they can, lead from the side, behind the team and really sort of empower the team and push them forward. And I think good leaders need to do all of that. But the key is that they signal what they're doing. So they, as you sort of said at the outset, they're really open and saying, look, this is a decision that I've made for these reasons, and we're not going to consult on it. We're going this way. That's it. But other decisions, you may say, look, this one, I want to co-create the solution. I'm not sure. Let's do it together. And you signal again a different approach. And again, at the heart of all of that is having someone who's genuinely authentic. You have good faith. There's sort of trust and connection back to where we started, the relationship. So as an employee, I listen to the leader and I think, okay, I'm going to assume good faith. I have confidence. I have trust. We have social capital between us. There is some capital in goodwill in the organisation. And so if they need to take us in this direction, even though I think it's unpopular or it's difficult, I'm going to trust them because we're going over there. But I can see also sometimes they operate in this way where I feel I can really empower to share my view differently. And again, the best leaders know when and how to do all different types of leadership.
Yeah. You use something you call the coral reef metaphor. Why is that such an important model for leadership?
Well, I think so. I used it in the talk as an example of sort of co-creation, right? I think coral reefs are some of the most spectacular living systems where there's no like one dominant organism. It sort of all works together in a kind of ebbs and flow. And I think that's sometimes a helpful analogy for thinking about good leaders or leadership in a kind of systems sense. Where back to where we started, we're all connected in some way, and every action has a reaction, and so again, thinking of leadership in terms of a system, or thinking as your organisation is some form of system. It's not a command and control organisation, or not necessarily. They are systems within that, whether you see them or not, they are there. And so choosing when to kind of do one style of leadership versus when to really understand that it's a system, and that to really change behaviours, you need to change incentives, or you need to change motives, or you need to change capability, or you need to change, how you come together, whatever it might be, which is much more about the systems, not just about telling people something.
And I love what you just said about actually it's whether you see it, they're there whether you see them or not. Because again, I think too often people get very preoccupied with the stuff that is very evident, that it's just in front of them, and they don't think about the hidden parts of a system that can have huge influence and huge impact, but it hasn't been really considered because it's a bit too far removed. Go on.
Yeah, I was just saying it's so ironic because most leaders have worked as employees in the organisation, would have experienced the system themselves, right? So in some sense, it's sort of tactical memory loss to like suddenly think there is no such thing in my organisation.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? I hadn't thought of it like that. It's tactical memory loss. So in diplomacy, you talk about moving from winning arguments to building alignment. And you've kind of already touched a little bit on that, but what does that actually look like in practice?
So, in practice, it's, we live so from a diplomacy perspective, we live in a kind of very challenging context, particularly at the moment. It's competitive. There are more conflicts now than we've seen for a while. The global order, if you like, and norms and institutions that have guided us over recent years are kind of under threat and undermined. And things become much more transactional in the kind of international relations space. And so, not to deny that it's a very tough combative world at the moment. But I mean, it's same as diplomacy, as I think, for businesses and organizations and families. When diplomacy ends, so there is no more talking, there's no more listening, there's no more empathy, there's no more imagining a shared future together, then I think we're in a really difficult spot at that point. So the role of diplomacy then, as I said, even when you fundamentally disagree, is to find out where there are joint interests and recognize that everyone has their interests, and that is perfectly legitimate in some senses. But the idea is really to try and find out how we can influence their approach and influence, but try and find a shared interest. And that's that's for me what the sort of goal of diplomacy is, and effective influencing at the kind of international relations diplomacy perspective.
There's honestly, that what you're talking about, there are so many levels of things that I want to go into, and I'm just so aware of time. So I've got to stop my mind going off in a million different directions of things I want to ask you. We've talked about curiosity, and there's obviously the theme of connection running through all this. We've talked about trust. Let's talk a little bit about clarity and courage and challenging assumptions. So again, in terms of thinking about what you talked about in your TEDx, the Plato's cave lens is powerful. How does it influence the way you interpret complexity or uncertainty?
Yeah.
No small question there, by the way.
I love it. Like the big questions. I studied philosophy and theology at university, and we came across Plato's allegory of the cave there, which, if you haven't seen, is a really good one. For basically, he describes a situation where people in a cave looking at the wall of the cave, and their shadows projected on the cave that come from a fire that's behind them they can't see, from people doing various things that reflect the shadows. And his main sort of supposition is that all they know is the shadows. For them, the reality is the shadows. But those in the light, they realize they're just shadows. There's a reality out here that's very different. And so the whole challenge there is around questioning perceived reality. And so philosophy, what I really enjoyed was it was about not getting to a right answer. Right, the goal of doing a philosophy degree was not like, here's a question, there is one answer. There was basically, it was around helping you to really ask better questions, to interrogate things, to think about assumptions, and to your point, to hold uncertainty and conflicting views in kind of tension, and be comfortable with that, because the world is often grey and complicated. And so, for me, and particularly the world today, where it seems like getting to the point of understanding truth in the world of deep fakes and echo chambers and curated feeds, the idea that truth is sort of slightly negotiable and is sort of slippery, it takes much more courage now to really try and unpick all of that and sort of keep seeking for much more clarity in the world today. So for me, it came from a kind of philosophy degree. So teaching someone to think rather than to have the right answer.
And I think you just touched on a really good point there about the whole, with in a world of deep fakes and curated feeds, it feels like it's getting messier and messier and messier in terms of trying to work out what's most right and what's definitely not right, and understand that there might not be a definitive right. So what does clarity look like for leaders in terms of what? I'm just trying to think about kind of leaders listening to this and thinking, right, well, that's great saying we need a bit more clarity, I've got to challenge assumptions, but what does that look like?
So I think so for me, it's someone then goes back to like really challenging assumptions. So someone who's got who invests time in really thinking about and challenging assumptions that of whatever is presented as the facts or the analysis or the kind of the context for which I'm making a business decision in. Is someone who then has, I think, some clear principles around how they think about the world and think about making decisions or think about interpreting the context. So someone who says, these are the kind of principles which help guide me get to that and think it through. Someone who's I think comfortable saying that don't know and actually spends more time than, as we said, really triangulating points and being wary of people that kind of very, very confident in a particular view in that sense. So a combination, but I think it's back to the kind of curiosity of really sort of interrogating information and challenging where you get your information from and who you get it from. So again, do you have bubbles around who are influencing you and where you're thinking about and learning about the world and the context and the community in which you operate? And giving us something deliberately provocative there, saying, I want, to your point, like, what would the opposite view be here? What's the opposite fact? And why is the opposite not true? So someone who just is, I think, wary of that and seeks to keep asking why and challenge themselves and their teams to kind of get better clarity through that process.
And I think that process is I spend a lot of my time working with people to help them think about the process of getting to the end point. And you've just described brilliantly that bit around decision making, like how do people make decisions, what influences them, what do they need to check out to make sure they've got the right information to make the decisions they need to make. And I mean, I run whole sessions on how do you do decision making, and people, but again, it's the space that people often don't think about. It's like, well, we just make decisions. Because what you were saying about we need to challenge our assumptions, you and I agree that that's really important, but actually making sure that happens in day-to-day practice is quite different, isn't it? It has to have such intention around looking at the data I've got and really questioning it and not taking things at face value. Again, that takes extra headspace, extra time to do that, and people will often skip over that because time feels too tight and we're sort of running at full speed and we've got to make decisions really quickly, and of course that's when you end up getting more challenges arising because of those decisions aren't always the best ones. There's definitely a skill set there for leaders to get their head around, I think.
Yeah, and I think I agree. And not all decisions are equal in some sense, right? So there are some decisions that are material and difficult to reverse. There are other decisions where you can say you can easily backtrack, you can learn from it and make a different decision. So again, I think good leaders know the sort of magnitude of decision that you're making in terms of orders of magnitude. And if it is something that is big or has material impact, then absolutely, I would say let's make sure that we invest time in having someone does the red team, having the kind of shadow board process, having someone who argues the opposite set of recommendations. So you really try and interrogate what your assumptions are and how valid those assumptions are by being open to speak to people who have very different views or external partners or think tanks or organizations. And that then gives you much more confidence then in your assumptions to make the bigger decisions. So I would say it's not all decisions, but certainly for the big ones, material is worth doing it.
And that leads me nicely on to my next question, which is around the Ash conformity experiment, which you talked about. And I'm interested to ask you what you think it shows up about how easily groupthink creeps into teams and organizations.
I feel again, I found it, I remember reading this a long time ago. It's a fascinating experiment, it's still very valid, which essentially gets a participant to come and look at 3 lines on a chart. And there are 3 other people that are actors alongside the participant. And the question they asked is very simply like, this line here that I'm showing you is the same length of which line A, B, and C. And it's like, for example, it's clearly the same length or height, should we say, as line C. The other 2 are too high or too low. But the other 3 who start are the actors who deliberately give the wrong answer. And so you're the participants, the 4th person who does it. And, over 50% of the time, I think it's something like 70% of the time, they conform. So they give the wrong answer just to be part of the group of 4, rather than sort of clearly saying it's obviously not the same as that one. They're clearly different heights, these lines. But such is the power of conformity and being part of and fitting in that they think it's easier to do that. And then it's a kind of group decision. And I think that, speaks volumes for the world we live in today. And, for those of us who have the parents, and children and all the kind of social pressures, and the same for teams. It speaks to a very core human instinct to belong and to fit in. But actually, it's not that useful for business in some ways. You want people to be like, in some sense, radical and say what they see, and to be brutally honest about their lived experience in the organisation or the world as they see it, even if it can be completely discounted in some senses because it might not be accurate for the company, but it's a voice heard. So I think it's enormously powerful, and again, leaders to be really aware of that as a dynamic in a meeting or in an organisation. So you imagine round tables where if someone's, you can imagine if 3 senior people say, it should be this thing, then the 5 remaining people, the incentives on them to stand out are probably much lower.
Yeah.
Thinking about everything from how you set your information up to how you manage meetings like that, because it's such a big driver of sort of human instinct.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of, ties in really nicely what we've talked about in terms of drivers of behavior, what motivates us, that needs to fit in, psychological safety, the leader taking or setting an example by what I'm actually expecting here. I'm expecting people to disagree. I'm expecting, asking slightly kind of different questions around, you all seem to think this is the answer, but what if this was the answer, and deliberately sort of provoking some different responses. And I think leaders have to understand their responsibility in actually just deliberately mixing up the pot a bit. But they tend to avoid that because they want everyone to get on. They don't like the challenge. They sort of actively seek to keep everyone on the same page and in agreement, because then things get done much quicker. But it's not, the quality is often not quite as it should be, because you have, as you say, you haven't got everyone's opinions.
And again, I remember a civil servant, senior civil servant, who ran his department at the time on this premise that in making the decision, I want maximum challenge. So I want us to have maximum challenge. I want voices out. I want disagreements. I want us to work it through and debate it. Once we've made a decision, then I want maximum loyalty to that decision. And I thought it's a really nice way of doing that, because ultimately what you don't want to do is create a big debate and then leave the room having decided it's this way, and then for people to then say, well, no, I disagree with that completely. And then you've got a kind of disunited leadership team. So again, the idea for me would that speaks volumes for like getting good leadership team. It's a maximum challenge, but once we make a decision, even if you disagree with it, it's our collective leadership decision, and this is it, maximum loyalty. And I think that's a helpful framework.
It's really lovely. I really like that. So before we move into thinking about some sort of practical takeaways from this conversation, I want us to just pause to reflect on what happens when curiosity and connection and courage are not present. And we see in societies what happens when, sort of in communities, in workplaces, people are not feeling connected. They feel that sense of being part of something is absent, and that cost of disconnection can be really devastating. I know you've seen this as a challenge in South Korea. What have been sort of the consequences of this stuff being absent, and sort of what has that taught you about the importance of getting connection right and psychological safety right?
Yeah, I mean, so Korea, like many places in the world, does have challenges around mental health and particularly suicide. Sadly, in Korea, someone dies every 40 minutes by suicide, whereas in the UK it's 90 minutes. So it's still not that much better. So it is shocking, and it's something that's a high priority for both governments and businesses. And yeah, I mean, there's a very complicated set of reasons and rationale for it. But fundamentally, it comes down to that, connection, belonging, and well-being and being valued. So something we're working hard on here in consultation with our friends in Korea is, how do we make it more of a mental health and sort of those dark thoughts, more of an everyday conversation like you do with your physical health, and encouraging more open conversation, because it's frankly it's okay not to be okay, and that should be something which is pretty normal, and should be discussed, and people should be looking out for each other ideally. So in the kind of in the business context and in the organisations that work in both Korea and the UK, this is, I think, a key thing around getting supporting the well-being of employees, frankly.
Mm. I mean, it's there's been such a lot of I don't know what it's been like in South Korea, but certainly here there's been a lot of emphasis on mental health and well-being, and lots of organizations now have people in position, mental health first aiders and so on, who people can go and talk to. But I still have a huge worry about the sense of high performance at whatever cost. And people are very good at masking um, what's really going on behind the closed doors, and are seen to be successful and high performers, and keeping everything going just as people would like it to be. And I think that's where we can have a sort of sense of we should be focusing on mental health and well-being, but unless everyone is thinking about that on a day-to-day basis, rather than someone's picking up the problems when they arise, if people aren't building in that culture of people can speak up when things are not feeling quite right, or people feeling slightly overwhelmed with something, or whatever the challenge is, just on that day-to-day basis, is just normal practice. And if people are performing really well and they're seen to be the kind of people who are successful, always question, it goes back to questioning assumptions, question at what cost that's coming at. Like, are they working all hours, or what are they not doing in order to be able to succeed quite so well? So it's really sort of interrogating that space, and that means that every leader, every team leader, needs to be aware of the kinds of things they need to check out, those assumptions, those questions they need to ask. And again, going back to that sense of connection and belonging.
Yeah, and so for me, like, again, some of the best leaders I've worked with are authentic humans. They say, I just had a bad thing. I'm not feeling up for it. Various things going on, and just sort of leaders talking through their challenges of mental health, and what they're doing about it in a kind of very normal way is enormously powerful.
Yeah.
In quite quickly changing the culture of an organization, that it's okay not to be okay. And
Yeah.
even the leader or leaders or the CEO, the boss, has had a bad day and is feeling, down about ABC.
And I think that is such an important point, Gareth, because the number of people, when I'm doing one-to-one work with MDs and CEOs, and they take their mask off when they're with me. And
Yeah.
I've had people in sessions in tears, or just saying, I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to, what's expected of me in my role, or I don't feel able to do this role. And suddenly the mask comes off, but then they put their mask back on when they're with the rest of their team. And I often ask you, what's stopping you showing some of this vulnerability that you show with me with your team, so that they can see that you are a real human being who is also struggling with the day-to-day pressures of life, from your whole life, um, and actually showing some of that and saying, I need some help, and I don't have all the answers, and can we pull together, and this is my big headache at the moment, I want everyone to help address. That's the stuff that kind of really pulls people together. But so many people are really fearful of doing that, so that's showing that human side, whereas actually that vulnerability would be hugely helpful for the leaders, but also the rest of their teams in terms of pulling them together, I think.
Yeah, fully agree. As I say, like, and the heart of that is a kind of trust relationship, right? That there is a kind of goodwill and trust in the organization that if I do that, that is not going to be something that's used against me in whatever way employers could, right? So that's the nub of it. But I fully agree. You need to take a risk sometimes, a leader, and that is maybe the quickest way to help shift the culture.
Yeah.
Is to start from you and to start from the front and start that way and take a risk.
Exactly. So I'm aware of time. We're having extra special long episodes though, which is good because I've got you on this call. I'm like, right, I'm going to interrogate you, find out as much as I can. So you have talked about three kind of core areas, which are curiosity, connecting, and having courage to challenge. So to help listeners think about how they can anchor those sort of three areas, what would be a practical action or actions that people can take from this conversation today so that they can think about developing those aspects of their practice?
Cool. Well, I think we've talked about a few of them, so maybe I'll try and remember and summarize, and we can summarize together. But I mean, certainly on the curious bit, about people, ideas, the world, recognizing that all of us are learning all the time. So there's kind of humility in that. We talked about shadowing. I think sort of either walking the floor, sitting with teams, shadowing others. Or that might be your suppliers. Could be thinking quite broadly, right, about your ecosystem as an organization and how you really understand that. So I think that's quite a practical and very powerful signal. We talked about asking sort of why questions more to really sort of get beneath, and maybe it's kind of multiple whys as you keep sort of peeling back layers and not necessarily just stopping at the first answer that you get. And I think we talked a bit about, for me, like listening hard to what's unsaid and who's not speaking, and sort of being curious about the dynamic of a particular meeting or whatever the environment is. So thinking not just about the words you're hearing, but much more broadly about what is the norms and situation here, and who's not here, which maybe says many more things than the words that are being said. On the connect side, I think it's around those relationships, so investing in the relationships, building social capital right across the organization, ideally, and sort of getting to know people's lived experience. We talked a bit about the bubble, so really thinking about who you listen to most and where you get your news and insight and intel from, and being sort of thoughtful about that and saying, is that balanced, and do I have enough diversity and variety of views and challenge in that process? And whether that's making sort of day-to-day decisions or the kind of governance architecture of the organization, and thinking, to your point, about how you make decisions fundamentally. I would encourage sort of leaders to think much more radically about that. And then finally, the kind of the courage and the clarity one. I think, again, for me, this sort of back to that maximum challenge, maximum loyalty. For me, that's kind of what high performing organization looks like, is that there is space and safety to really challenge, but when a decision is made, there's loyalty to really implement that decision, in the best interest of the organization.
You summarised that very well, Gareth. Because you've actually talked about a lot today. And what we'll do on the back of this episode is produce like a summary that people can download of some of your key points that you've made today as a kind of prompt. I think sometimes in the past, listeners have said they almost need a pen and paper to kind of go through and take notes as people are talking. So you have talked about a huge amount. I'd like to finish with sort of one final reflection from you, which is a question that kind of touches on some of what you've talked about already, but just as a kind of closing thoughts, what does courageous leadership look like in a world as interconnected as ours?
Wow. So courageous leadership. I think so. For me, it's leaders who lead with like real empathy for because ultimately in organizations and it's all about people, right? Fundamentally, whatever the kind of policies, organizations, and big geostrategic things we've talked about, it comes down to people. So someone who's sort of leading with empathy and humility at the core, and has clarity even when it's uncertain and complex around them, even if it's clarity of process to get to more clarity. But it's someone who has clarity but leads with empathy. I think secondly, I'd say someone who shares power, so someone who's confident enough to bring others in, to co-create, to sort of bring and develop solutions, and even to sort of lead from behind more in terms of empowering others in the team. And then finally, I think it's someone who really leads based on principles, not on popularity. Make decisions for the long term or in the best interest of the organization, and not necessarily short-term pressures. So someone who's got a very clear sense of the principles which guide them as a human being, as a leader. and then lives those out.
Yeah, I love you've mentioned principles a few times during this conversation. I think that's that comes to that clarity of who you are as an individual leader, and I think that's a really good place for people to start, is thinking who they are and what's important to them and what their principles are. Um, you have honestly shared so much today. I'm so grateful for you joining me, Gareth. Thank you ever so much, and for staying on slightly later than normal at the end of your work day, as I'm just starting mine. Really appreciate that. We're going to put your sort of contact details, LinkedIn and so on in the show notes. The TEDx talk is not yet live, but when it is, make sure you share that, and I will also share that on LinkedIn, so that people can sort of tune in and hear what you said on that, which will resonate really well with what you've talked about today. So thank you ever so much. I really, really appreciate your time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much for a really interesting and fun conversation.
If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, there are 3 things I invite you to do. First, click the link in the show notes to download the resources for this episode. Secondly, help me extend the reach of this podcast by leaving a quick review on Apple or wherever you listen. And please share this episode with your colleagues so that you can discuss what resonates with your team. And finally, as usual, I invite you to reach out to me on LinkedIn or through my website so that we can keep the conversation flowing. I know listeners often say they're keen to implement some of the key takeaways, but sometimes find it tough without guidance or extra support. If that's you, drop me a line and let's chat. If you're listening to this in autumn 2025, then keep them peeled for my brand spanking new website that's coming soon. Be sure to check it out. It's timeforchange.co.uk to find a whole heap more to support you to reflect on and develop your own practice. And while you're there, join my mailing list to stay up to date with bespoke support services like my new retained partnerships, where I'm by your side through all things leadership, culture, and performance. Feel free to reach out if you want to know more. I'm a great sounding board for challenges and ideas for development, so grab all the details you need from the show notes. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to the next episode coming soon. Join me then.